Paula Treichler's How to Have Theory in an Epidemic, Cultural Chronicles of AIDS, is an ambitious and multifaceted examination of the cultural dimensions of the AIDS epidemic. Treichler, a scholar at the intersection of feminist studies, linguistics, and cultural studies, expands her influential essay AIDS, Homophobia, and Biomedical Discourse, an Epidemic of Signification, arguing that AIDS is not just a biomedical phenomenon, but also a complex cultural and linguistic construction. She contends that the ways in which AIDS is understood, represented, and responded to are deeply embedded in cultural narratives, systems of power, and ideological frameworks. By revealing how biomedical and media discourses intersect with social prejudices and political ideologies, Treichler demonstrates that the epidemic must be understood not only through science, but also through the ways language constructs its meanings. The central argument is the idea that language is not a neutral medium, but rather a site where meaning is produced, contested, and disseminated. She critiques biomedical discourse for perpetuating reductive binaries and exclusions, such as self and general population, and first, third world. These oppositions, she argues, not only fail to capture the complexity of the epidemic, but also reinforce cultural anxieties and social hierarchies. For instance, the framing of AIDS as a gay plague in the early 1980s created a discourse that pathologized homosexuality, while simultaneously reassuring heterosexual populations of their safety. Similarly, the discourse around innocent victims, a term frequently applied to children, and hemophiliacs, implicitly constructs a distinction between the blameless and those deemed responsible for their illness. Such narratives, Treichler argues, obscure the structural and systemic dimensions of the epidemic, including the ways in which socio-economic inequality, gender, and race shape vulnerability to AIDS. The book is divided into two parts, spanning the 1980s and 1990s, during which Treichler tracks the evolution of cultural and scientific responses to the epidemic. She examines how scientific discourse, activist interventions, and media representations interact to shape public understanding of AIDS. Treichler is particularly attuned to the ways in which biomedical knowledge is not produced in isolation, but rather emerges within specific cultural and institutional contexts. For example, she explores the debates around the origins of HIV, noting how theories that situate its emergence in Africa often reproduce colonialist and racist assumptions about the Third World as a site of primitivism, danger, and disease. These narratives, Treichler observes, not only stigmatize African nations, but also deflect attention from the global interconnectedness of the epidemic. Treichler also addresses the role of gender in the construction of AIDS discourse, arguing that women have often been marginalized or erased within both scientific and cultural narratives. In the early years of the epidemic, women were frequently overlooked in biomedical research, as the disease was initially framed as affecting primarily gay men. This erasure, Treichler suggests, reflects broader societal tendencies to render women invisible in discussions of power, sexuality, and disease. When women do appear in AIDS discourse, they are often portrayed in reductive or contradictory ways. For instance, women are sometimes depicted as vectors of transmission, particularly in narratives about mother-to-child transmission, or as symbols of despair and suffering, especially in discussions of the epidemic in the Third World. These representations, Treichler argues, obscure the agency and lived experiences of women while reinforcing gendered and racialized stereotypes. Treichler is critical of the ways in which AIDS has been represented as a problem elsewhere, whether geographically, socially, or culturally. She notes that media and scientific narratives often construct a global view of AIDS that situates the epidemic in distant or marginalized populations, such as African nations, intravenous drug users, and gay communities. This process of othering, she argues, allows dominant groups to disavow their own complicity in the epidemic, while maintaining existing structures of power and inequality. Treichler's analysis of the global dimensions of AIDS discourse is particularly insightful, as she highlights how the epidemic has been used to reproduce colonialist tropes about the Third World, while obscuring the political and economic factors that contribute to its spread. By situating AIDS within a broader cultural and geopolitical framework, Treichler challenges readers to confront the ways in which global inequality shapes both the realities of the epidemic and its representation. Treichler emphasizes the importance of cultural analysis and theory as tools for deconstructing the meanings that circulate around AIDS. She argues that critical theory can help to expose the ways in which language, power, and knowledge intersect to shape our understanding of the epidemic. At the same time, she is careful to balance her critique of scientific authority with a recognition of the importance of practical measures and activist strategies in addressing the crisis. Treichler is deeply respectful of the efforts of AIDS activists, whose work she sees as central to challenging stigma, demanding accountability, and advancing scientific knowledge. She highlights the ways in which activist movements, such as ACT UP, have used cultural and rhetorical strategies to disrupt dominant narratives and create spaces for alternative understandings of the epidemic.